good evening. I want to welcome you to our study of the Bible, the Word in a Year. This week we're transitioning out of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, into what are known as the historical books. These books, they tell the historical narrative of the nation of Israel. And the first book of this section of the Bible is the book of Joshua. Now, the book of Joshua, it's a book marked with much transition. The first notable transition is that of the leadership of the nation as a whole. So what we're going to find is previously, for much of the 4 books that we just talked about over the last couple of weeks, the nation of Israel was under the leadership of Moses. From the released out of bondage in Egypt, through their journey in the wilderness, and finally to their arrival in the Promised Land, Moses was leading this nation through this transition period. But due to Moses' disobedience, God forbid him from entering the Promised Land, and he was only allowed a brief glimpse from the top of Mount Nebo, which we talked about last week. Moses' successor is a man named Joshua, and Joshua had served as a right-hand man of sorts for Moses throughout much of Moses' leadership. And Joshua, along with Caleb, were the only 2 spies sent into the Promised Land in the book of Numbers who gave a good report about how the land was ready for the taking. So Joshua, he was a fighter, and this would lend itself well to the job that was set before him here in the Promised Land. The second transition is the transition from the wilderness to the Promised Land. The land is what Israel had been longing for ever since they left Egypt, this Promised Land of sorts. So rather than being wandering in the wilderness, they're going to be arriving at the Promised Land. And now it's time for them to take them. It's time to take what God had given to them. So as we begin this book of Joshua, we find both of these transitions at the forefront. And there's 5 notable sections to this book of Joshua. The first is Joshua being commissioned. The second is Israel entering the Promised Land. The third is the conquest of the Promised Land. The fourth is Joshua dividing the Promised Land. And the fifth is Joshua's charge to Israel. So Joshua's commissioning in the first chapter of this book, it marks the notable transitions that we spoke about earlier. No longer would Moses be in charge of the nation of Israel, but it would be up to Joshua to take charge of this nation. And the first chapter begins with the reassurance of Joshua by God that just as he was with Moses, so he would be with him as well. And when we think about the shoes that needed to be filled here, it was no small task for Joshua to assume this role. Moses was an incredible leader, and now it was up to Joshua to assume this role. But God's assurance to Joshua is something that even today we can take heart of as well. And 3 times, God tells Joshua to be strong and courageous. And this is something that we need to realize in our own lives. Anything that God calls us to do, anything that we step into, God goes with us. And because of that, we can face those challenges with boldness and with courage, knowing that God goes with us. So after Joshua is commissioned, he assumes command and he rallies the nations of Israel. And it's interesting to see that he uses the same words that God gave to him to address the nation of Israel. He says, be strong and courageous. And anytime a leader is encouraged, what will naturally flow down to the people who are under their command is something that they have in their own spirit. So after Joshua assumes command of the nation of Israel, they begin their entrance into the Promised Land. And their conquest of the Promised Land, it begins with a city that's called Jericho. And in Jericho, they find help from a very unlikely source. It's a prostitute named Rahab. And Joshua, he sends spies to Jericho in order to figure out what's going on in the city, to see what it's like. And in order for them not to get caught, they're hidden by Rahab in exchange for her family being spared during the conquest of the city. So Rahab, she hides the spies, and they disappear eventually, and they get out of sight. But it's interesting to note that we find the same Rahab listed in the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. So these spies, they're hidden by Rahab, they escape, And then it's time for Israel to enter the promised land by crossing the Jordan River. The priests, they bear the Ark of the Covenant and they enter the Jordan River first. And as soon as they enter the river is rolled back and they cross on dry land. And this is another amazing occurrence of God rolling back the waters for Israel to cross on dry land. And as a way of remembering this, Joshua, he commands members from each tribe to choose a stone and to place it as a memorial in the middle of the Jordan River. As Joshua and Israel enter the promised land, they begin their conquest then. And their conquest, it begins with the city of Jericho, as we talked about earlier. And this was an incredibly thick-walled city. It was an incredibly impregnable fortress, a town to kind of conquer. But this is a very familiar story for us, right? We know Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho. So Joshua and Israel, they march around the city 6 times. On the 7th day, they march around 7 times. And on the final time, they blow trumpets and shout, and the walls, they tumble down. Now, the people of Israel, they were told not to keep anything for themselves. This was a sort of a first fruits of sort for God. But there was one man who was disobedient. His name was Achan. And because he robbed God, the entire nation, they end up suffering. So after a successful battle at Jericho, the nation of Israel, they suffered defeat at a much smaller city called Ai. And it's discovered that Achan had taken some of the spoils of the city for himself. And because of it, Israel was punished. And it's punished. And it serves to remind us of the fact that we should not rob God of what we should be giving him. Giving to God in our offerings, our tithes, and our abilities, our talents. It keeps us in covenant with him. And when we fail to do these things, we can fall out of covenant and also lose our hedge that's around us, our protection. So after the nation repents for Achan's sin, they achieve a victory over Ai. In another battle with 5 kings of the area, Joshua asked of God that he would make the sun stand still so that they could achieve victory over their enemies. And the rest of this section, it details how the northern and the southern areas of the Promised Land, the northern and southern areas of Canaan, were cleared out by Israel. So this 4th section details how the Promised Land was divided up. Joshua was advanced in years, and there was still more land to be cleared of Israel's enemies. But this would be the job of the individual tribes, individual nation, or portions of the nation of Israel to do, and whenever they were given their various portions of the land. So Joshua begins the process of dividing up the land to these various tribes. Each tribe was given a portion of the land, and they were meant to live in that section and that section alone. It wasn't like you could move around. You were meant to live in a single area. If you were from that tribe, then you lived in that area. And each tribe, we find out from previous books, they had a certain area of land except for the Levites. They had an inheritance from the Lord and were given cities rather than whole chunks of land. So the final section is Joshua's charge to the nation of Israel. And he reminds them to do what's right according to the law, to be faithful to their covenant with Yahweh, to be true to everything he's done, and to be faithful because he's been faithful to them, to clear out the remaining inhabitants of this land. And he reminds them that the Lord will fight their battles for them if they're faithful to him. And we see a charge similar to what Moses gave to Israel in the book of Deuteronomy. Joshua says, choose this day whom you will serve. And then Joshua says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And this is a powerful reminder to all of us that we have a choice of whom we serve. And the choice should be clear to us. We should choose to serve the Lord. So at the end of this book, Joshua dies, and it leaves Israel again without a leader once again. And God provides leaders in the book of Judges, but Israel continually fails to live up to their end of the covenant, as we're going to talk about next week. So what takeaways can we have from the book of Joshua? How can we see maybe Jesus in the book of Joshua? Well, first, Joshua was a warrior who conquers his enemies. And in the same way, Jesus has put all rule and authority under his feet. Second, Joshua is a victor who shares the inheritance with his people, just as we share in the inheritance of eternal life through Jesus' victory over death. Third, Joshua was a leader who followed the law of God, and likewise Jesus followed after his Father, only he did so completely and perfectly. I hope you've enjoyed our study, our quick overview of the book of Joshua. I hope you have a wonderful week this week. I can't wait to talk to you next week as we go into the book of Judges and the book of Ruth. Have a great week.